So the purpose of this video is just for us to summarize the Industrial Revolution. So just get a quick introduction, background information about what the Industrial Revolution was, and then also to focus on some of the key short-term and long-term impacts of the Industrial Revolution. And in doing so, look at some of the positives and negatives that have come as a result. So just for a bit of background information, for our purposes, we're really looking at, the time period from the 1750s on, and we'll be focusing on the area, essentially the UK, Great Britain, where the Industrial Revolution, first began. What exactly was it? Well, essentially, it's a time of great invention and innovation. And some of the things that were invented during this time, included the assembly line. We've also got the telegraph, which, revolutionized communication technology. The steam engine, which really changed the way people would travel, and we also distributed goods across large areas of land. The sewing machine was an incredible invention at the time for the textile industry, and the textile industry was one of those things that was really prominent in the UK in this period. And also the internal combustion engine, which really laid the foundation for all sort of modern personal vehicle travel in today's day and age. Now, what essentially happened, we talk about this term revolution, and revolution essentially means, a period of great change. The change that actually occurred over this period was that we moved, or society moved, from a mostly agricultural society, to a manufacturing society. So if we're thinking about revolution in terms of our cause and effect language, let's think about the cause, what would make this happen, and then what actually occurred as a result. Well, the cause is the fact that we had all these inventions, right? So the cause was the innovation and the inventive new technologies that were created. The effects we need to unpack a little bit more. The effects were both short-term and long-term. And what do we mean by that? Well, short-term impacted living conditions at the time, but also, we're still feeling the long-term impacts on the modern world. So anytime we're studying the Industrial Revolution, or if we're actually thinking about this as a concept, this is a time of really exceptional change, exciting change, that had a lot of short-term and long-term impacts. A lot of those were positive, but there were also some incredibly negative things that happened. I might give you just a short summary of the pros and cons, just in a really wide range here. These won't be separated into short and long-term, but we can think about this as, an introduction to some of the effects that were used. First off, obviously there were advancements in production. There was massive growth in inventions. Workers in general received higher wages. And there was massive improvements in transportation technology. all of which have very clear positive impacts. Some of the negatives, however, really deplorable, and by deplorable I mean, just absolutely terrible working conditions. Quite unsanitary living conditions, and also incredible food shortages as well. So that's basically our introduction to the Industrial Revolution. Obviously, there's quite a lot more information we can unpack there, and we will in future lessons. But as of right now, we want to use this as a point for discussion when we are talking about the short-term and the long-term impacts of the Industrial Revolution. So we'll get into that now. This presentation will be on short and long-term impacts. Now, cause and effect is a really important part of history. We've discussed cause and effect ad nauseum. We need to look at the effect an event had on the world, and we do this by breaking them up into short and long-term consequences. There is a little activity here where we think about the short and long-term effects of COVID on the world. And if you'd like, I'd like you just to pause the video now and have a discussion with the person next to you. What are the short and long-term effects, and how do we tell the difference between those two things? Once you've completed that activity, we'll start looking at some of the short-term impacts of the Industrial Revolution. So, massive short-term impact was the fact that population growth started to increase significantly, and this resulted in a lot of urban planning that needed to take place. There was a dramatic increase in world population because, as we mentioned, the standard of living was increasing now that people weren't having to, rely on agriculture as their main source of income. And so the amount of people that were actually just living in countries increased dramatically. There was a mass movement of people from rural areas to cities. And we know that the major employer of people was farming. Prior to 1750, probably about 90% of people were engaged in farming. These people all moved to the cities and got jobs in factories. Big cities in the UK like London, Leeds, Manchester and Birmingham, grew really quickly as a result. And urban planning was introduced for the first time because people who were in positions of power realised that people need to have structure in the way they're living. We take for granted now the fact that all of our streets are really well designed. We live in these really well plotted pieces of land. That was not the case in the UK at this time. And if anyone's ever travelled to the UK, particularly the really old parts of the UK, you can see sometimes how cities were planned in this really sort of haphazard way with not a lot of thought. So what are some of the advantages of these changes in population growth and the movement towards cities? Well, we have this situation where running water is available. We did have a situation where heating was now available to people, particularly in the UK where it gets really cold. And we had improved sewage systems, which results in healthier conditions for people and fewer outbreaks of disease. There were planned, drained and uncluttered open spaces created for sport and entertainment. That's a big thing. This leisure time was not something that people were used to. For the most part, if you had a job or if you were working from sun up to sun down, and then you were resting the remainder of the day. So leisure time was a massive change that occurred at the time. We also, due to some of these improvements in technology, we had gas-powered and later electric street lights, which meant that a nightlife could exist, and potentially there was an increase in the safety of people now that the streets were lit up in the evening. Start to see the development of suburbs, public transport, all of which allowed people to live further from factories. Moving on, we'll have a look at some of the other short-term impacts of the Industrial Revolution, and potentially you could expand on these in your notes as well. So improvements in agricultural technology, meant a lower risk of famine due to crop failure. If there's a lower risk of famine, again, it adds to population growth because less people were, passing away or getting diseases due to lack of food. Increased food production again, meant that more people could afford more and better food, again, increasing production, keeping workers healthy. Mass entertainment was available to all people, not just the rich. Saw the development of railways, which meant that travel times were speedier. We started to see the advent of holidays, people taking time off for work. We also had mass-produced consumer goods, which is more affordable for a lot of people, which means that disposable incomes increased. Disposable incomes started to increase. And the advent of the telegraph and the telephone, news spread quickly around the world. I mean, it's pretty difficult to imagine not being able to instantaneously communicate with someone regardless of where they are in the world. But, this is the world pre-industrial revolution. Okay, there is a little activity here just thinking about what kind of language could we use to show cause and effect. What I'd like you to do is to have a go at this activity because this is really important for your assessment. And if you can nail this, it'll mean quite a lot for your chances of getting a great score in your assessment. Have a go at picking some of this language to try and show cause and effect of 3 of the sentences on the previous side. So pause the video and have a go at doing that. Okay, now we'll have a look at some of the long-term effects of the Industrial Revolution. And I know that I'm moving through this quite quickly. We'll get time to unpack a lot of these in class over the next few lessons. So, about the emergence of socialism and trade unions. And essentially, this came from, working class people who now had more rights or were seeking more rights. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, in a lot of senses, feudalism was still rampant across the UK. And if you remember from your study of the Middle Ages or medieval times, feudalism was this incredibly exploited. I was trouble getting this out. Incredibly tough system where you were in a certain class and there was not a lot of opportunity for social mobility. So we have these theories come about with socialism where means of production are publicly owned and resources are allocated to people according to needs. So it's very much sort of people-based rather than power-based. And by power, I mean, people who were in power at that time. We also saw the emergence of trade unions, which I'm sure you would have heard of. Trade unions are an organised group formed by workers to protect their rights and ensure that their interests are taken into account. And what this tried to prevent was to prevent exploitation. So 2 very prominent theorists in the work of socialism and also communism, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So Industrial Revolution was driven by an economic system called capitalism. And Marx and Engels argued that capitalism essentially was the root of all evil because it was the exploitation of workers for purely profits. And, if we look at the working conditions and the living conditions of these people, we can see how they would have come to this idea because people were really getting exploited to a great extent. So their idea was to come up with this socialist point of view where there's welfare provided for all people, regardless of whether you're rich and poor. And also this other system, which is the communist system, where private property was completely abolished. And we've got a fun little example here to show the differences between some of these political thoughts. So a little thought experiment. Imagine you have 2 cows. Great, awesome. Socialism means that the government might take 1 cow and give it to your neighbour. Communism means, all right, well, we'll give the cows to the government and then we'll trust the government to give you like the milk from the cows so we can share it all. Fascism, which was made famous by Mussolini in Italy and then also Adolf Hitler in Germany. You give the cows to the government and the government decides to sell you some milk. And capitalism, you have the right to choose, what you do with these cows. Are your private property, so you might sell a cow and buy a bull. So it's quite obviously a simplified example, but might give you an idea of what these type of political systems are about. Okay, a few more things for us to consider in this lesson. In reaction to a lot of the inventions that were taking place, a lot of people were really resistant to these changes. Kind of like the same way people are resistant to artificial intelligence now because they think it's really dangerous. Well, people at this time would look at sewing machines. They would look at, this weaving technology. They look at these massive factories and they would think that they were incredibly dangerous. So this group called Luddites, the Luddites, led by this guy called Ned Ludd, actually went around and attacked factories, smashed machines, and killed the owners of factories because of the wage reductions and job losses that were going on. So the Luddites were, these people who were fiercely resistant to the change going on in the Industrial Revolution, and as a result, they were punished accordingly for that. Also, a group called Chartism, or an idea called Chartism, a group of reformists published a People's Charter demanding a better life for people through parliamentary change. Now, they were quite ahead of their time because it's quite similar to what we see today. We do have our voices heard by parliamentarians and we have the opportunity to vote people in and out of government. But at the time, this was viewed as quite a revolutionary idea and it wasn't very popular with the people that were in power. So some examples of the 6 points of the People's Charter here. I'll let you read through them in your own time if you want to pause the video and have a look, but you might recognise, the representation similar to what we see today, although obviously, there probably was not equal rights for women and there weren't necessarily equal rights for people of different ethnicities as well. Okay, so trade unions, a little bit more additional information here. Skilled workers realised that they needed to protect their jobs and their incomes because otherwise they would just get exploited continually by the owners of these businesses. So these friendly societies developed into trade clubs and then into unions. Now their main weapons they can use is the threat of strikes, and I'm sure we all know what a strike is. So stopping work until they can, get the rights they feel like they're entitled to. We also saw, the emergence of some modern lifestyles. So some factory owners, people who are lucky enough to work in these factories, realised that happier people are more productive, they work harder. So that means that, they started building houses for employees as well as hospitals, baths, churches and schools that their employees could all frequent. There were improved health conditions, which led to fewer outbreaks of disease and more efficient workers. Compulsory education, courses in technology and self-improvement, and better agricultural production meant workers could afford better food. Now, I want you to, stay vigilant here and know that a lot of these things were motivated by self-interest because at the end of the day, productivity was what it was all about. So if people were healthier, they could work longer. If people were fed more, they can work longer. If children were educated, they can work longer and they can do it more efficiently as well. So just keep in mind, what people's motivations are during this time. Some other long-term impacts, population growth. So in 1801, the world population was about 1 billion people, and just over 200 years later, that has grown to over 8 billion people. And that is a exceptional increase. Over the history of human civilization, we've never seen the increase in the population at such a rate since after the Industrial Revolution. Also global inequality, particularly due to imperialism, and the greed of colonial nations, imperialism. If I've spelled that wrong, apologies. So a lot of people in different countries around the world were getting exploited to a great extent, had really poor working conditions, and, in some instances, quite a lot of child labour as well. Finally, some environmental impacts. Look, everything that's sort of wrong with the way that we produce, pollute, and the climate change that's occurring can really be traced back to the Industrial Revolution, because we started emitting a lot of fossil fuels, we started using a lot of really bad chemicals to put into the environment. Air pollution became rampant, and industrialised nations started polluting at an extremely great rate. We also saw examples of water pollution, which is obviously really dangerous for the spread of disease and things like that. And also deforestation, ridding the earth of its natural resources, which are there, they're in place to actually protect the environment. And so that ends our video for today.